I think we all enjoy hearing about each other's family stories and their ancestors. And isn't it funny how, as much as we all like to brag about our own ancestors, and when we find somebody famous in our family tree or some big historical event that our ancestors were part of, let's admit it, when somebody else is telling about their family, we want to hear about the screw ups in their family tree, right? We want to hear about the ones that got in trouble or pulled some really ridiculous stunt. And why is that? Are we all just that sadistic? Or do you, or do you think that we're all looking for some validation that, well, good, I'm glad to know that everybody else's family was as messed up as mine is. Uh, and I wonder why is it that we don't like to tell those stories about those people? There's always ones in every family that we're not supposed to talk about. And why not? They're the interesting ones to me. Anybody, let's try to turn to that. Anybody can have a king in their family tree, right? How many of you have got a horse thief that got hung in your family tree, or Billy the Kid in the family tree? You've just almost got Frank and Jesse James in yours if you haven't read the article in the Quarterly yet. His ancestor rode with Frank James, and now you've got to read the Quarterly to see what the story is. Who's yours? The one that got hung for horse thieves?
Missouri, and I've got a poem that was made famous about it.
Did any of it rub off on you? There's an episode of an old TV show, I think it was Father Knows Best, but I couldn't find it, where the town is celebrating its Heritage Day, and they want to celebrate the Andersons' ancestor because he was the hero that saved the town by warning them that the British were coming. And when they get to researching, it turns out that yes, he did warn them, but it was as he was passing through town on, let's just call it a rapid, unauthorized retreat. So, yes, as he went through town, he yelled, "The British are coming." So, the family hero is not always quite as heroic as everybody thinks. So what I've got tonight is just kind of a mixed bag of anecdotes about my family. And I hope that it will encourage you to embrace those stories about your family that you might not always be quite so proud of. The ones that Grandma said, don't tell it, don't pass this one along, don't tell it to anybody. But there's no reason not to tell those stories and pass them along. And it's not to belittle anybody and not to make fun of anybody. And believe me, when I talk about my own family tonight, I'm not trying to make fun of them. But I want everybody to see that all of our families are human and make mistakes. And it just makes me cringe when I see these genealogy shows on TV and somebody is just horrified to find out something bad that their fourth great-granddaddy did. Really, people? I mean, I'm barely responsible for my own actions. I sure can't be responsible for somebody's from 150 years ago. So lots of families have that one branch of the family also that either was, or more often than not just thought they were, a little bit better than everybody else. Do you have those in yours? In my family, that was my maternal grandmother's family, the Mosley family. And it has become a running family joke in my family about how much better and how much more refined and how much richer and of purer blood the Mosley family was than anybody else, regardless of in our family, just than of anybody. Now, my dad's mother was the fun one. Daddy's mother, my mama, wore paisley prints. She dug in her flower bed. She smoked and drank Schlitz beer. She came to a Halloween party one time, dressed head to toe in aluminum foil and wouldn't speak, so the kids of us didn't know who she was. On the other hand, my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, bless her heart, she was the biggest stick in mud I ever knew in my life. Her clothes came from Rosenblum's. When she was mad, her cuss word was D. And that stood for drat, but she couldn't bring herself to say that. If she was just really upset, she might on occasion say double D, which of course stood for double drat. About the only time I ever saw her laugh was when the bad guy would get shot on Gunsmoke. And I really wasn't sure if it was just my family that thought that or not. So a few years ago, I was visiting with a lady in Paducah who was my mother's first cousin and the same age as my mother. Now, this lady's mother and my grandfather, the grandfather who married into the Mosley family, were brother and sister. So her parents would have been in-laws to my grandmother. And I asked her why it seemed that even though she and my mother were the same age and were first cousins, that the families just didn't seem to have that much interaction with each other when the kids were growing up. And after hemming and hawing around just a little bit, she finally very politely said, well, we just always felt like they thought they were a little bit better than we were. And I said, I knew it. It wasn't just me. Everybody thought that. You all saw it. She said, they lived in town and we lived in Beach Bluff. She said, your mother had toys. She said, when I would go to their house, your mother had store-bought food. And the one she remembered particularly was boiled ham. She said, my daddy hunted rabbits all night so that he could walk to town the next morning to trade for groceries to put food on the table. And by the way, if my grandparents had store-bought ham, it was probably because my granddaddy worked for a wholesale grocery company and he was probably bringing home the stuff that was out of date. And so we've always said in my family, and only half kiddingly, that the Mosley line was the one that the rest of the family just couldn't live up to. And actually, to some extent, that's turned out to be right. A few years ago, I finally put all of my research down into a book for my immediate family, and I divided it into 4 chapters, one for each grandparent. And the chapter about the Mosley family was longer and bigger than all 3 of the others combined. There was that much more information about them. Back in early Virginia, they did have some big-time connections. They were probably quite rich at one time. But, you know, there's always 2 sides to every story. And tonight I want to tell you about some of the generations of my Mosley ancestors. And if while we're doing this you do feel the building start to shake, it's not an earthquake. It's my mother Nell out at Ridgecrest Cemetery rolling over in her grave, okay? So the first ancestor of this family to come to America was William Mosley. He came here from Holland in 1642. Now, he was English, not Dutch. Volumes have been written about him, and I forgot to bring them, but the most recent book I have about the Mosleys is 2 volumes. They are this size, and each one is this thick. So altogether, it's about a 4-inch thick book, and I actually had a little bit of input into a couple of pages in that book. William had gone to Rotterdam, Holland, to live. He was working for the Merchant Adventurers of London. They were a trading company that dealt worldwide in trading with other nations, and it was headquartered in Holland. He married a widow whose husband had died owing some rent on a warehouse. So the very first thing that happened to William when he got married was he got sued for his wife's debts. The merchant traders were dealing in cloth and spices, anything you can imagine that was being traded worldwide. But when I got to looking into their records, he was a shipping agent for a beer company. And I kind of wish that my mother Nell had still been alive in 1977 when I went to work driving a Budweiser truck, because she would have fainted when she'd found it out, and I could have said, Mother Nell, I got it from your side of the family. Your ancestors were the ones in the beer business. Well, things weren't going well for the company back in Holland, and an agent for the British Parliament had written home and said their secretary is a cunning knave, and that cunning knave was William Mosley's brother-in-law. So the Mosleys moved to Virginia and came to America. Now, the family brought with them a number of large family portraits, and this is the portrait of William Mosley that were done by a famous Dutch artist. Many, many years ago, thank goodness somebody took photographs of all of those portraits, because now nobody seems to know where any of them are. They all disappeared back in the late 1800s. The Mosleys had also brought with them a lot of expensive jewelry, and William traded several pieces of that jewelry for livestock so that he could become a gentleman farmer in Norfolk. But the buyer then wrote back to him kind of questioning the value of the trade to see if he got stuck or not. And since he was out of town, Mrs. Mosley wrote back and answered the letter herself. And I'm glad this got her name on it, because otherwise I could not have told you that this was Susanna and not William if you look at the picture. She said, I personally bought that jewelry. I carried it and had it appraised. I guarantee you that it is the value that he said, but I need the cattle more than I need the jewelry. Now, maybe it's just you, but I cannot help picturing green acres here. Probably the most noteworthy thing that happened to this part of the family, though, is that two of his grandsons were judges in the Grace Sherwood witch trial, which if you have studied Virginia history, any you may have heard of. Grace Sherwood was a local lady who had been long suspected of being a witch, and so a panel of women was sent out by the county court to examine her, and they came back with the report that Grace had 3 of something that women normally only have 2 of. And that, of course, proved that she was a witch. But not surprisingly, they couldn't ever find 12 men who were willing to sit on a jury because they were all scared of her. So eventually, the court ruled that they would just try her themselves to determine her guilt or innocence by ducking her. Now, it was a known fact that a witch can't sink. So if you duck the witch and she sinks, that means she's not guilty. She's drowned, but she's not guilty of being a witch. So they tied Grace Sherwood to a chair with her left thumb tied to her right big toe and her right thumb tied to her left big toe and tossed her in the lake. Well, she managed to get herself loose and bob up to the top. That, of course, means she's a witch, but she's alive. So she was sentenced to 8 years in prison for it. In 2006, then, the governor of Virginia officially pardoned Grace Sherwood. And this statue of her now stands on Witch's Duck Row in Virginia Beach. And my family had a part in sending her to jail. The next generation of the family to me was William's son, Arthur Mosley. He was the second son. And, of course, we know that in that day and time, what being the second son meant, it meant your big brother was rich and you weren't. After he married, he and his brother seemed to have kind of parted ways. It may have been because he sued his brother over something. It's funny how those things work, and that tends to get between a family. But when Arthur tried to buy land in 1692, he found out that he couldn't because he'd been born in Holland. And so he was not a British citizen, but a Dutch citizen. So he had to be naturalized. And the main reason that he wanted to be a naturalized British citizen was so that he could get a tavern license. So, Mother Nell, the first one was a beer distributor, the second one ran a honky-tonk. And this is Arthur Mosley in the portrait that they brought from Holland. The next generation in the family was also named Arthur. Strangely enough, he married a woman with the same name as his mother. They were both named Sarah Hancock. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that, I guess. It just seems a little bit weird to me, though. Actually, he and his wife were first cousins, but in that time period, that really wasn't all that odd a thing. He moved away from the Norfolk area, even though all the rest of his family seemed to stay there, and he moved up around what's now Richmond. He seems to have lived a fairly normal life. He had 2 wives and as many as 11 children, and in 1730 he died, leaving a very large estate. But it was in this generation, but in a family that wouldn't marry into it for a few more years, that the first good real scandal came into play. Henry Clay would in time be the great-grandfather of the famous Kentucky politician. But at this time, he was an Indian trader who lived in Virginia. Well, he died in 1760, and 12 years after he died, 2 of his former slaves' grandchildren filed a suit against his estate, saying that their grandparents never should have been slaves to begin with, and as such, they should be free. Well, his widow was still alive, so she testified in court that Henry had told her that he had been on a trading trip in Carolina. He thought the tribe was Cherokees, but he wasn't sure. He had bought 5 children from them who were enslaved from war with another tribe. He thought the Choctaws, but he wasn't sure about that either. He said, I sold one of the kids, 2 of them died, the other 2 I brought home, and they remained as our slaves. But 2 more friends of his testified, well, what Henry told us was that as he was leaving the Indian village from trading with them, he saw these 2 kids out playing, and he snatched them up and kidnapped them. And that he then hid out in a hole in the ground for 2 weeks, thinking the tribe was going to come looking for him. And they never did. The court sided with the grandchildren, and they ordered that all 9 of the grandchildren of those original 2 kidnapped slaves, plus their own children, all be freed, because they said they never should have been slaves to start with. One small story of justice in that time period, I guess. Another newsmaker in this same generation was a Dr. William Irby. Now, there was a sheriff at the time named Edward Hill, who was apparently a big-time political bully, and he threw his family influence around a lot. Sheriff Hill had tried to forcibly take Dr. Irby's horse, ostensibly saying that he needed to chase down some runaways with it. But Dr. Irby said, no, I have a sick patient I've got to go call on. You can't have my horse. Well, Sheriff Hill grabbed it by the reins and started to take it forcibly. At this point, Dr. Irby punched him. Now my ancestors are assaulting police officers. That didn't do the trick, so he drew his sword and was just about to whack the sheriff over the head with a sword. But Mrs. Irby grabbed his arm and stopped him, and a friend of his standing there said, look, I'll loan you a boat to go see your patient if you just won't hit the sheriff over the head with your sword. And Irby said, I'll let you, my friend, borrow my horse, but I won't have this sheriff take it away from me forcibly. Well, the sheriff had him arrested and charged. He was sent to the governor for trial. Unfortunately, those records in Virginia don't exist, so we really don't know how the trial came out. But he is found in records for many years afterwards, mostly being in court trying to collect past due doctor bills. In one of the cases, the man that had not paid the doctor bill said, well, I didn't pay him because he didn't get my wife well. And Dr. Irby said, well, she didn't get well because she didn't do what I told her to. So the court ruled in his favor, told the man he had to pay him, but they put off payment until the next court session. And in the meantime, they ordered Dr. Irby to go get the woman well. When they came back to court, surprise, surprise, the man filed assault charges against Dr. Irby, and the fine that he got was just a little bit more than what the doctor bill due was. And the court said, Dr. Irby, you haven't gone to call on the woman, you haven't gotten her well, your case is dismissed. The next generation of my Mosley family moving forward was a 3rd consecutive Arthur Mosley. They didn't have but about 4 names in this family, and they just kept using the same ones over and over. Now, this Arthur was a successful businessman in the 1700s. Today, there is a tiny little village in Virginia called Mosley, Virginia, that probably is named after his generation. But he did marry well. His wife was a member of the Cook family in Virginia, and that's C-O-C-K-E, one of the biggest families in early Virginia. Among the famous people who claim descent from this family are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Robert E. Lee, General George Marshall, both President Bushes, and, of course, me. But Arthur's life wasn't perfect either, and in a 1736 newspaper, we read that on his way home from court day, he got killed in a horse wreck. So his wife at the time was pregnant with their 8th child. She got married again very soon. Now, I will tell you that if my grandmother had been telling this story, she would not have said that his wife was pregnant. She would have said she was that way. As soon as the kids got old enough, they filed a lawsuit against their mother, saying that their mother and her new husband, their stepfather, were blowing their inheritance. They sued their own mother for their inheritance. Their son, my next ancestor, at least they changed the name. This one was Edward. And now we're up to about the time of the American Revolution. His family were strong patriots during the war. He almost surely knew Patrick Henry on a first-name basis, but they too were not quite an ideal family. One of his sons, not my direct ancestor, but an uncle, died at 37 years old. And when he died, the local storekeeper filed a claim against the estate for a past due store bill that he owed. Now, the court was concerned apparently that some of it might be gambling debts, and gambling debts were not legally collectible. So they said, well, you need to show us the store bill to prove that it's a legit bill. This is just part of one page. The entire thing is about 6 pages. And if you can't read it, I'll start at the top, and this is a listing on the bill. 1 pint of brandy, half pint of brandy, 1 quart of brandy, 1 quart of brandy, half pint of brandy, 4 pounds of cotton, a gallon of rum, a quart of rum, a half gallon of rum, a pint of rum, a half pint of rum, a pint of rum, a half gallon of rum, a quart of rum. I think we're starting to see why he was dead at 37 years old. I think that's pretty obvious. But the biggest problem that this generation of the family caused was not even of their own doing. It was by so-called genealogists. Our DAR ladies will probably tell you that the DAR is very strict now about lineage proof to get in. They haven't always been that way, apparently. And in the 1920s, an author named Stella Pickett Hardy published a book where she gave specific names and dates of a Bible record for this generation of Edward Mosley. There were almost immediately some questions raised about it. Things just didn't seem to add up well. And John Frederick Dorman, who is a very respected researcher, said, well, I found other records written by Stella Pickett Hardy that didn't seem to add up very well either. One researcher wrote to her questioning in the book, and she wrote back, personally, I believe the records are correct, and I would not hesitate to fill out DAR papers on Edward Mosley based on the Benall Bible as evidence. Well, they asked members of the Benall family about this Bible, and none of them knew anything about it. They'd never heard of such a thing. So finally, in 1994, the man who wrote the book that I forgot to bring with me tonight, Dr. Warren Forsyth, published an article in the National Genealogy Society Quarterly about this Bible record where he basically proved that the entire thing was a forgery. For one thing, and the really dead giveaway, was that in Ms. Hardy's Bible, it said that Hillary Mosley had married Langston Finch, when actually they were both men, which at that time was not legal. It turns out that a biography had been written about a descendant, and this descendant, it said, was the grandson of Hillary Mosley and Langston Finch. That's true. Those were his 2 grandfathers, not one set of grandparents. Now, that could be an easy mistake to make, except that in her book, Ms. Stella Pickett Hardy gave the exact date and place of their marriage. She also had a marriage date for this Edward Mosley in 1717. The actual marriage on that date was in 1797, and it was for a distant cousin with the same name. So as a result, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Ancestry.com family trees who use the information from this Bible record, and not one word of it is true. Well, in the next generation, my ancestor, and this is the article about the Mosley Bible record from the National Genealogy Society Quarterly. My next generation was also named Edward. He was a very rich man. He owned and operated 3 ferries that ran across the Stanton River on the roads that you pretty much had to take if you were leaving Virginia, headed to Tennessee or Kentucky. As far as I can tell, he was boring. We're not going to talk anymore about him. I hadn't found any good stories. But his son Robert took care of all that for him. Robert Mosley married a girl whose father had died, leaving a trail of debt everywhere he went. When he died, administration of his estate was granted to the local sheriff rather than to the family. And I think that was probably because they were trying to ensure that his debts got paid off. What little bit of estate he left mostly wound up in the hands of the attorneys. And just a few years later, when his widow died, her total estate was 3 cows, a bed, and a few pieces of furniture worth a total of about $60. Hardly in keeping with the Mosley family standards. Her oldest son took over the leadership of the family when the daddy died, and he seems to have kind of raised his brothers and sisters. Now, a few years down the road then, when Robert Mosley marries their daughter, her second baby, the custom in naming at the time is to name the second boy after the maternal grandfather. Her father's name was Zachariah Birthright. Her brother's name was Peter Birthright. She didn't name her baby Zachariah, she named him Peter Birthright Mosley, after her brother. And I can't help but think that maybe it was that she wanted to continue the tradition of keeping her family name intact, but she wasn't too proud of her daddy, and her brother was the one that had raised the family, so she used his name instead. They also had moved away and left Virginia, came to Tennessee, leaving a younger brother to inherit the estate. And it just looks very much like Robert Mosley probably married way below the standards of what his family generally did. So the Mosleys settled in what's now Greenfield, Tennessee. They were rich landholders there. At this time, the Obion River carried ferry boats that came in to load cotton and then floated all the way out to New Orleans on the river. And Robert Mosley decided to have a canal dug beside the river to build a water mill. And the man who was telling this story years later said that when they finally got through with the canal, he said it took a long time. It was quite expensive, he said, both in the lives of the slaves that dug it and in the cost of it. And they got all through and it flowed backwards because he said they had the grade so wrong that the water mill never got built. It was totally useless. Well, one of his sons during the Civil War was ordered along with 2 friends by Union General Dodge to rebuild a burned bridge at Shade's Bridge. Carolyn, we were talking about Shade's Bridge coming in. That's pretty much right on the Gibson County, Weakley County. It's in Skullbone, right? General Dodge ordered them to rebuild the bridge because he said, I know you're the ones that had burned it. And what had apparently happened was that they found out that a Union cavalry troop was coming through that way, and they were going to assault them and mug them, so they hid out under the bridge waiting on them. Well, in the meantime, it rained, and they got all their gunpowder wet. So the gang that couldn't shoot straight just sat there while the Union cavalry rode right past. But not to be outdone, they burned the bridge after the fact. That son, the one who burned the bridge, also had 2 sons of his own. And in the early 20th century, they were apparently the Greenfield town eccentrics. One of them's name was Tobe Mosley, and they told that Tobe Mosley was worth a small fortune. And one day he had lost a big packet of government bonds. And when one of his neighbors found it and returned it to him, Tobe was so thankful that he gave his neighbor a nice big juicy orange for it. And then Mr. Dolan, who was the one telling these stories, that I'm sure Carolyn recognizes that name, Mr. Dolan said that Tobe had walked to a nearby town one day, probably Dresden, to cash in some bonds. And when he got ready to go, the bank manager said, now, Tobe, the train back to Greenfield costs 52 cents. And he said, well, I think I'll just walk and save the 52 cents. When he died in 1928, he had never married. I can't imagine why not. And he was worth $135,000. Another one of Robert Mosley's sons was my 3rd great-grandfather, Peter Birthright Mosley, the one that was named after his uncle, not his granddaddy. He had come with his parents from Virginia to Weakley County when he was a teenager. He lived into his 90s, and he told stories to his grandchildren about growing up. He told them about how he had tried to vote for president the first time for Andrew Jackson, and they told him, go home, son, you're not old enough to vote. He told them about going with his brother to hear David Crockett make a campaign speech. And he said Crockett was trading animal skins for drinks. And there was one man reaching through a hole in the fence and would get the skins and trade the same skin over and over for drinks. Now, what Peter Mosley didn't tell was who it was doing that. So whether he just saw this happening or participated in it, we'll never know. When he died at 93 years old, the newspaper said he was the oldest man in the county at the time. The house that he built in the 1840s stood well into the 1970s. I did get to go in it one time when it was already sitting there boarded up and abandoned. And the one thing that I can tell you I remember about it is that it had two separate upstairs wings. And to get from one side of the house to the other one, you had to come down the stairs, right through the front parlor, and back up the stairs on the other side. So you.
Was that house on the road between Greenfield and Dresden?
Yes, sir.
On the right side?
You weren't at the keg party the night it got burned down, were you? That's it.
That house for years and years.
Yep. And eventually it became a hangout for keg parties and got burned down is what happened to it. I do have a lot of the bricks out of the chimney. The woman that owns the property is a cousin that lives in Huntsville, and I have the bricks out of the chimney of it. But yes, that's the house. Peter and Eleanor Mosley had 9 children. The oldest of them was my great-great-grandfather, Robin Mosley. He grew up in Greenfield. He got sent to college at Caledonia College in Paris, which later became McTyree Institute. Unfortunately, he got there in 1860, and the next year the college closed because the entire student body resigned to go join the Confederate Army. Now, he was barely 18 at the time, and a whole bunch of boys from Greenfield all came together and signed on at Jackson that same day. Can you imagine a bunch of teenage boys leaving Greenfield, coming to Jackson to join the Confederate Army, the bragging and the boasting and the smack talking that was going on all the way down here with, well, when I see a Yankee, here's what I'm going to do. Well, I'm going to do this. I would think after they went through the Battle of Shiloh, they all got a little bit quieter, because right after the battle, he said that his captain said, I quit, I'm going home, y'all do whatever you want. Several of them signed on with Nathan Bedford Forrest and rode in a company that was commanded by Nathan Bedford's brother, Bill Forrest. Now, one biography of Nathan Bedford Forrest said that the only man in the world he was ever scared of was his brother Bill. And their company was called the Gang of 40 Thieves. I don't really want to know why. I'm scared to ask. When Forrest made his, and this is Robin Mosley, my great-great-grandfather. When Forrest made his famous Memphis raid, this was the company of men that rode their horses into the lobby of the Gayoso Hotel and stole all the cigars from the front desk. One of them supposedly signed the guest register and thanked them for their hospitality. Thankfully, I have never read the name of the man that signed it because I'm afraid it might have been John R. Mosley, but I don't know. He was wounded in that raid, got sent home to heal, and as a result, when the war ended, he was in Weakley County at home. And so when he tried to get a state pension years later, they said, you must have been a deserter. You weren't with your command at the end of the war. He lived to be 91 years old. This is an article that my grandmother's older brother wrote about him riding into the Gayoso. And he told his granddaughter, this is him, Robin, with my mom, when my mom was 6 years old. She said all she remembered was she was a lot more impressed by that kitten she's holding than that old man they told her to stand next to. He told his granddaughter a few of his war stories. One of the ones he told her was that they had a bunch of rookie conscripts in East Tennessee. And they told all of these boys, now you need to sleep close to the fire tonight in case the Yankees attack during the night. And then they hollowed out a bunch of corn cobs and filled them up with gunpowder. And as soon as the rookie conscripts got to sleep, they tossed these giant homemade firecrackers into the campfire and stood back and laughed when those guys went nuts. He also told about when he was a little boy and he got into a fight with one of the little slave girls while they were both working in the cotton field and tore up a bunch of cotton. And he said, I heard Papa coming and I knew we were both going to get a whipping, so he ran and hid and left her to take all of the punishment from it. I did a few years ago get to meet this little lady in Dresden who was a niece and the most perfect little southern lady you'd ever want to meet. We had tea on her bone china while we were there. And she said, I do remember Uncle Bob talking about once when he was home during the war and had to hide in the hayloft from the soldiers. And I said, well, Miss Ruth, do you know if it was his own soldiers coming to take him back or was it the Yankees trying to capture him? And she kind of giggled and said, well, you know, I don't suppose I know. And then my great-grandfather, J.E. Mosley. He was a wheeler-dealer businessman. He was the president of the Bank of McKinsey. He then had a hand in starting a second bank in McKinsey. He traveled to New York and Washington, D.C. on business, and this is in the early 1900s. And I've got to show you this picture. He's in the very back corner, and this is a tour bus riding around Central Park in New York City in 1906. Is that not a great-looking wagon to be riding around Central Park in 1906? And as I say, he's the man on the very back row back there. Then when he moved to Jackson in 1909, he founded the Red Cross Co-op Drug Company. He owned multiple properties in Jackson. He was one of the developers of the neighborhood of Walnut and Roland Streets. This poster shows where they were having an auction of lots that he owned in what later would become Fite's Bottom. If you're not a lifelong Jacksonian, you may not know Fite's Bottom was for many years the biggest slum in Jackson before they finally tore it down a few years ago. In the 19-teens, he got involved in the oil business in Texas and Oklahoma. I have at home a metal box full of stock certificates for oil companies and oil wells. On one occasion, he was getting offers from a company in Oklahoma to buy one of his oil wells, and when the offer got up to $5,000, he finally said yes. But right after he mailed the signed papers back, he got another offer from them for $10,000 for the same well. So he hops on the train and tried to get to Oklahoma to beat the letter back to accept the higher offer in person. He didn't make it. He had to take just the $5,000. By the way, when he died, his widow did check all of those stock certificates, and they were every one totally worthless. Their family lived on Campbell Street, just across from the lake. If you know the house where Mayor George Smith lived for many years, that's where their house was. It's where my mom was born. Their property ran all the way up to Westwood and then all the way back to the ditch that separated Westwood Gardens from Tigert School. If I figured correctly, it was about 400 acres in Midtown Jackson. And then when he died, my great-grandmother traded it all for a little house in East Jackson where my mother grew up. It got bulldozed by the city a few years ago because it was abandoned and caving in. Mother had sold it for, I think, $12,000 in the 1970s. And when I found his estate papers a few years ago, I found that when he died, he left a total estate of $218. And so I've kind of concluded that Papa Mosley was one of those that we've all known, I'm going to hit it big next time, or maybe the time after that. But one of these days, I'm going to hit it big. I have a portrait of him, and a few years ago, my daddy saw it and said, son, I've spent my whole life trying to live up to that man. And I said, Daddy, he died before Mother was even born. Mother never knew her granddaddy. And he said, I realize that, but I've still spent my whole life trying to live up to his reputation. So I guess the main legacy that he left our family was the mahogany piano that he bought and doubtless could not afford, which now sits in my living room on a heavily braced floor because we were afraid it would fall through and go all the way to the ground. By the way, when my great-grandmother, his widow, died a few years after him, she left an estate valued at $4,000. I think the wrong person in the family was the one handling the business matters. And now we're down to my sweet grandmother. She was the only daughter in a family that produced 2 ministers, a professional musician, and a travel agent. And if she had known in this picture that my mother was doing this right up behind her, it really wouldn't have mattered because she probably wouldn't have known what it meant. Of course, there was also that one son in the family that got sent off to military school, which generally at that time meant you sent your out-of-control kids to military school. I've never really been able to find out what he did, but we don't talk much about him because of that. I do know that at one point he bought a car when he was 20 years old from McGee Ross Hardware Store and then wrote a bad check for $10 for the payment on it, and his daddy had to pay off the car note for him because he'd written a bad check. Now, my grandmother did on at least one occasion take a chance on bringing scandal to the family, and that was the day that she and a bunch of her friends showed their legs. All of these teenage Jackson girls showed their legs, and I guarantee you their mother and daddy never saw that picture. And then on her honeymoon, she went even further. She wore pants. And I'm sure that she wasn't home. Her mother didn't see it, I know. How my grandmother managed to get married to my pop, I'll never really know. He was the oldest son in a family that had to quit school when he was 13 because his daddy died, and he had to work to feed his mother and 3 brothers and sisters. To quote an old phrase, his family didn't have a pot or a window. He was 10 years older than my grandmother. He was 30 when they married. She was 20. And so after both of them had been long since dead for several years, I asked her youngest brother, who was 12 or 13 at the time they married, Uncle Hal, how was it that your parents ever allowed my grandparents to get married? And he says, well, Papa was already sick in bed with TB at the time, but he was still very much the head of the family. And he said they had gone to church together and showed up late after church and got home several hours late. And when they got home, they said, guess what? We stayed after church and got married. And he said, the whole family held our breath, waiting to see what Papa was going to say. And said after a minute, Papa kind of laughed and said, well, okay. And he said that was the end of it. Papa said, okay, it's a done deal. They were married. 7 months later, my grandmother had a stillborn child. Thank goodness the doctor on the death certificate only put premature birth. He didn't tell us how premature. I prefer to think it was by about a week or so. And that brings me up to my parents. And I'm not going to dish any dirt on them because my sister's here tonight and I don't want to embarrass her. And besides, my mother and daddy were perfect. They were perfect. So apparently, even perfect families aren't so perfect after all the time. Even they have their rogues and their renegades, and sometimes maybe even a few offbeat characters in the family. But I don't see any reason to pretend differently. We all have them. Can you imagine how boring our family trees would be without them? I say, embrace them. They're the ones that make us interesting. Thank you.